Hello everyone, hope you're having a really nice day. Thank you for those of you who gave me feedback on the previous video. I think it did help a lot of you the way I'm doing it, so I'm going to try and do this for every lesson if I can. Thanks to those also who asked questions about the lesson. It's really good to be asking for clarification now on the things that you're not sure of, instead of feeling like you're having to relearn the whole topic next year when we come to revise memory. So keep asking your questions. It's really good. So today's lesson, we're going to recap everything that we've learned so far about memory. So we're going to start off with short-term versus long-term memory in terms of encoding, capacity and duration. Then we're quickly going to look at multi-store memory model, the working memory model, types of long-term memory, episodic, semantic and procedural. And then we're going to look at the explanations of forgetting, interference and retrieval failure. Once we've recapped all those, we're going to evaluate retrieval failure. So how good is it at explaining forgetting? For your starter, I want you to take about 10 minutes and I want you to choose the 3 questions that you find the most difficult. So the ones that you're most unsure of are the ones that I want you to answer. So pause this video now and choose the 3 that you want to do. Okay, so the first question was, briefly describe research into capacity, duration and encoding. So this feels like we did it ages ago. So let's quickly refresh our memories. Research into capacity was done in 1887 by Jacobs, and he used a digit span test. Digit span test is the one that we tried in class, where he gave participants 4 numbers to start off with, and eventually he kept on increasing the numbers in the sequence, and he tested how many digits people remember in short-term memory. And he found that it was 9.3 items for numbers and about 7.3 items for letters. You could have also talked about Miller. He is the one who came up with the magic number, 7 plus or minus 2. And that's how much information we can hold in our short-term memory. So he found that people can count 7 dots flashed onto a screen, but not many more than that. And we can recall 5 letters as well as we can recall 5 words. And the way we do this is we chunk things together to remember them. So if you remember, we spoke about our telephone numbers and how we remember them by chunking the digits together instead of remembering them as separate digits. Duration, the study for short-term memory was done by Peterson, and he did the consonant, syllable and the 3-digit number task. So he gave participants, for example, THX 512, and he gave each group different retention intervals. So they would have to count down from the number that they were given, either for 3 seconds, for 6 seconds, for 9 seconds, for 12 seconds, for 18 seconds. And he found that after 3 seconds, there was 90% correct recall. When there was a 9-second retention interval, it fell to 20%. And when participants were given a retention interval of 18 seconds, the recall fell to 2%. So Peterson basically found that the duration of short-term memory is about 18 seconds. And then Barrick et al. did a test on the duration of long-term memory. So if you remember, they did the yearbook photo recognition test, and they found that if participants had graduated within 15 years of graduation, their recall for faces was 90% accurate, and after 48 years, it was 70% accurate. Then we've got encoding, and Badley was the researcher who did this. So he gave participants either semantically related words, so huge, big, tall, or acoustically related words, so can, man, bad, fan. And he found that participants had difficulty remembering acoustically similar words in short-term memory and difficulty remembering semantically similar words in long-term memory. And from this, we can conclude that short-term memory is encoded acoustically, whereas long-term memory is encoded semantically. Question 2 was about the multi-store memory model. So even if you haven't done these questions, if you feel like it'll be beneficial to you to write some quick notes, I definitely would. The more you rehearse something, remember, the more likely you are to remember it. So the multi-store memory model, we start with environmental stimuli. So we take in things from our environment from each of our senses, and this goes into our sensory memory. And our sensory memory can handle any type of information, but in order for something to go into our short-term memory, we actually have to pay attention to it. So if we're looking very intently at something and someone is speaking to us, we might not hear them, we haven't paid attention to it, whatever they've said isn't going to go into our short-term memory. But if something does go into our short-term memory, then we do a process called maintenance rehearsal, where we basically just repeat the information, even if it's just in our head. And the more we do this, the more likely it is to then go into our long-term memory. From our short-term memory, two things can happen for us to be able to forget the information in our short-term memory. Displacement, which is when old information in our short-term memory leaves in order to make room for new information, or decay, when we basically just forget it. In our long-term memory, there's 3 explanations of forgetting, which is interference. If you remember the lesson from last week, proactive and retroactive interference, decay as well, and retrieval failure, so a lack of cues. And in order for us to successfully retrieve a piece of information from our long-term memory, it has to go back into our short-term memory. So that's basically Atkinson and Shiffrin's multi-store memory model. Question 3 was describe one research study which supports Baddeley and Hitch's working memory model. The working memory model expanded on the short-term memory store from the multi-store memory model. So one research that you could have used was the case study of KF. Remember, KF was the man who was in a motorbike accident and he experienced some brain damage. And when Shalise and Warrington studied him, they found that he forgot short-term auditory information, but he could still remember visual information in his short-term memory. So this demonstrated that the short-term memory store is not a unitary store, as the multi-store memory model suggests, because there are at least 2 types of short-term memory. And the working memory model splits this into auditory and visual information. Question 4 was explain what is meant by episodic, semantic, and procedural memory. Episodic memories are memories for our personal experiences. So it could be a birthday party or a family holiday. And our episodic memories are remembered in terms of very specific details, context, and emotion. So the more emotional a memory is, the more likely we are to remember it. And the main brain region associated with episodic memories is the hippocampus, which is involved in learning, and the prefrontal cortex, where a lot of our personality is found. Semantic memories are our memories for facts, so it's our knowledge of the world. And these aren't necessarily tied to any context or specific details. So we remember that the capital of France, for example, is Paris, but we may not necessarily remember where we learned that information. It's just something that we know. So episodic and semantics are knowing that. And then procedural memories are knowing how. So procedural memories are memories for performed tasks or skills like riding a bike, driving a car. And these are implicit memories. So that just means that we know how to do it, but it's very hard to be able to describe it. And the main brain region associated with procedural memories is the cerebellum and the motor cortex. Number 5, what is the difference between proactive and retroactive interference? So remember this handy way of remembering. Proactive, remember the P, past learning interferes with new learning, and retroactive, recent learning, so new memories, interfere with old learning. And there were some pieces of research that we looked at for each of those. So proactive was studied by Underwood, who analysed findings from a number of studies. And he found that word lists learnt later on are remembered much worse than the ones that we learn earlier on. Participants who learnt more than 10 lists after 24 hours had a 20% recall, so they could only remember 20% of the words. Whereas participants who had only learnt one had a 70% recall. And this shows that past learning does interfere with new learning because of this difference in recall. Retroactive was studied by Muller and Pilsacker, who gave participants a list of nonsense syllables to learn for 6 minutes. And then some participants were given a retention interval, so they were asked to describe 3 landscapes, and then they were asked to recall the lists. Some weren't given this retention interval, and they found that performance was much worse when there was an intervening task, because the recent information for describing the landscapes was interfering with the old information of learning the nonsense syllables. Question 6 was, how does a lack of cues lead to retrieval failure? If you think back to last lesson, we broke it down into 3 components. The first one was encoding specificity principle. And Tulving and Pearlston found that the more cues a person is exposed to, the more likely they are to remember something. So they gave the participants category plus word. So for example, fruit, apple, or animal, panda. And those who didn't receive the category name only remembered 40% of the words, whereas those who did receive the category name remembered 60%. Then we looked at context-dependent forgetting, so just being in the same place where you learned the information can actually aid recall. And Godden and Badley did the famous study with the divers, and they found that those who learnt the words underwater recall better underwater, those who learnt the words on dry land recalled better on dry land. And then we spoke about how it's not only the environment that can make us retrieve information easier, it can also be our emotional or mental state at the time. And Goodwin found that people who had learned material when drunk recalled those things better when drunk again. So now we're going to move on to the evaluation part of the lesson. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through some evaluation issues. And then your task is going to be to take any 3 of the things that I've spoken to you about and write them up as peels. And I'll require a submission from you by Friday. So a strength of retrieval failure as an explanation of forgetting is that many studies support cue-dependent forgetting. So you can talk about Goodwin, you can talk about Godden and Badley, you can talk about Abernethy. There's lots and lots of studies you can talk about, and this increases the validity because there's so much research support. Another strength is that retrieval failure has been investigated by field experiments. So Abernethy was the one who tested exam recall, and students who took the exam in the same place where they'd learned the information performed significantly better. And you can also talk about Godden and Badley in the diver study. These are useful because they explain forgetting in real life situations. They have high ecological validity because their findings can be taken and applied to different settings. However, sometimes they are lab-based. For example, Goodwin's study was a lab study, and they're not like everyday memory tasks. So the ability to perform a learnt skill, such as riding a bike, usually isn't affected by state-dependent failure. So say you were really happy on the day that you learnt to ride a bike for the first day, it doesn't matter if you're sad one day, you will still be able to complete that task. So it doesn't explain all forgetting. Another weakness is that context effects are not very strong in real life. For example, how often are we faced with such different environments as learning over underwater? Our ability to remember things is quite good even in different contexts. We take our exams in a different context to where we learnt the information, and so therefore that is a problem for real life application. However, Smith did find the opposite of this, and as an example, if you're downstairs and you remember that you need something from upstairs, you go upstairs and you forget why you're up there. but then as soon as you go back downstairs, you remember what it was that you wanted. And this is what Smith found, that recalling the environment you learnt the information in often does help with recall. Another weakness is this idea of recall versus recognition. So it was found that Godden and Badley's findings only occurred when the divers had to free recall items. When they were instead given a recognition test, the context-based effect wasn't seen, so it didn't matter where they learnt the information, where they recalled the information. Cue dependency can't therefore explain all forms of forgetting. Another weakness is the fact that the encoding specificity principle can't be directly tested. So Tulving and Pearlston said that participants remembered more words because they had encoded the word with the category that they belonged to, so they'd given them a meaningful link, but this can't be empirically tested. Therefore, that's a weakness. And a final strength is that retrieval failure explains forgetting a lot better than interference does. And this was shown by a study done by Tulving and Stotka. And they found that when participants were given cued recall rather than free recall, interference effects disappeared. So this idea of old information interfering with new, or new information interfering with old, those effects weren't seen. Thus, the information is available, but it can't be retrieved. Retrieval failure is therefore more effective as an explanation of forgetting than interference. Your task now is to peel 3 of the evaluation issues discussed on the previous slides. And if you're looking for a challenge, I want you to make one of those peels a double whopper. And this is due on the 3rd of April, so this Friday. And if possible, please submit it as a Word document, just because it's much easier for me to be able to give you feedback that way. But I do understand that some of you will want it handwritten for your notes, so that's fine, only if it works for you. Let me know if you have any questions about anything, but mainly the evaluation issues that we've discussed, or if you're struggling to keep up with the work, or if you don't understand the task. Please let me know. Okay, bye.